Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann-Rabke, and my beloved Carl Rabke. We don't have the luxury of living in ordinary times, but rather we live in extraordinary ones where the way we live in the next decade will make a huge difference in the future of life on planet Earth. We aspire in this tapestry of rich conversations drawn from a variety of wise perspectives to share resources to help you embody the wisdom, compassion, and skillful actions that are needed during these times. You can find out more about our classes and sign up for our newsletter at embodimentmatters.com. You can also become a supporting member of our podcast with a small monthly donation. Look for Embodiment Matters at patreon.com.
Greetings, friends. We are so excited to share with you our recent conversation we had with Bill Plotkin. And we could have talked for hours with Bill about so many topics dear to our hearts. So Bill Plotkin is a depth psychologist, a wilderness guide, and an agent of cultural regeneration. He founded Colorado's Animas Valley Institute in 1981, and over the last 40 years he has guided thousands of seekers through nature-based initiatory passages. He's the author of several books, including Soulcraft, Crossing into the Mysteries of Nature and Psyche, Nature and the Human Soul, Cultivating Wholeness and Community in a Fragmented World, and Wild Mind, Field Guide to the Human Psyche. And much of this conversation centers around the journey of soul initiation, a field guide for visionaries, evolutionaries, and revolutionaries, which is an experiential guidebook for descent into the soul. And we begin the conversation, as we often do, looking at embodiment. And of course, Bill offered a really unique expression. He has a unique way of holding many words that are used kind of freely, like embodiment or initiation or soul or adult. And one of the things I loved about his definition of embodiment is an aspect of it being how humans can become life-enhancing partners of the earth and cosmos. When we look at Bill's framing of a kind of nature-based developmental model and how to tell sort of where you are at different stages. And as it's often recognized, the lack of the role of elder in modern culture, he looks even under that to see how few genuinely ripened adults there are, and how many adults are stuck in a late adolescent phase. And so we look at the whole notion of initiation and the importance of growing into adults. He explores how to have a mature urgency in response to these times, and gives a beautiful nod to Joanna Macy's work that Reconnects, and exploring how do we go from a life-destroying culture to a life-enhancing culture. So it's a wonderful book, and you can find out more about programs through the Animas Valley Institute at animas.org, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Welcome, Bill. We are so thrilled to meet you and really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here with both of you.
I want to start by asking you about one of the last sentences in your new book, The Journey of Soul Initiation. It's actually at the end of the acknowledgements. Mm-hmm. And I love reading the acknowledgements, which says, may we humans become life-enhancing partners with both Earth and cosmos soon. We often begin our conversations around asking what embodiment means. And it occurred to me to just refer to that sentence. And I wonder if you want to riff on either of those topics and where they come together.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that riff invitation.
Yeah.
Life-enhancing partners with Earth and the cosmos. I'm one who believes, actually have no doubt whatsoever, that we humans were evolved to be in relationship to the world the same way every other species on Earth evolved, which is to say that every species doesn't just sustain life or sustain its own life, but enhances life in its ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how evolution works, that if life was designed, if you will, to merely be life-sustaining, then once we got to single-cell bacteria, that's where things would have stayed.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that's not how it works, that that the number of species keeps diversifying, the cleverness and evolutionary success generally enhances for all species, and every species gives away to other species and to the habitat in general in its ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about that, we realize, well, what's going on with us humans?
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody who's paying any attention at all knows that not only are we not enhancing life right now in general as a species on this planet, we're not even sustaining life. We're in fact destroying life quite rapidly in a geological sense. Everybody knows about the sixth mass extinction and the effects with the pollution we're causing to habitat and climate disruption and loss of rainforests and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really become life destroying. So I've been asking myself now for quite a number of years, what happened? How is it that we appear to be an exception to life on this planet? Because I think in a deeper sense, we're not an exception. So my answer has become that most contemporary societies, some hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, have lost or forgotten our initiation processes that support a human, a youth, to move from psychological adolescence to true adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that every healthy culture that has ever existed, including the ones that ours came from way, way, way back, had this initiation process, had some version of this initiation process that I call the journey of soul initiation, hence the title of my new book.
Mm-hmm.
But we've lost that for a variety of reasons that we can go into a little bit later. But let me just say that I've come to the conclusion that humanity is nearing the end of a several thousand year long initiation process, in which we're a relatively young species, I think that's fair to say, and we're learning how to use our primary power that distinguishes our species from other species, or at least most other species, and that is our capacity for conscious self-awareness, which is to say this power that is associated with what we call the ego, or the part of ourselves that knows that we know. And we're still learning how to use that power. And the reason I say we're nearing the end of this initiation process, because we're either going to get through the portal soon, or we're likely to go to extinct, or be so devastated ourselves that there may not be many of us left.
Mm-hmm.
So, and from this perspective, I'd have to say that what's happening for us as a species, and has for several thousand years, and what's happening for the planet now, is not exactly a mistake, because it was inevitable that a species on any planet that evolves with the kind of power of our mode of consciousness is going to have a challenging time learning how to use it well. And I think it is possible to do that. And again, so my new book is doing two things. One is that it is mapping out what I believe is the deep structure of the journey of soul initiation. Again, it's a journey that we've lost thousands of years ago. Listeners might think that it's some version of something I already know, but most people don't really know what this is. It's something deeper and more mysterious than most people are aware of. So that's one thing the book is doing, is mapping the deep structure, which is to say, what are the patterns of what I call the descent to soul, that experience that we'd expect to find shared in any healthy culture on the planet, past, present, future. And the second thing the book is doing is presenting the particular version of that spiritual journey, the descent to soul, that we have been developing at Animas Valley Institute for 40 years, which is to say a nature-based Western contemporary version of this pan-cultural, pan-human initiation process. So I believe that ultimately, for us to have healthy cultures, again, which is to say, not just life-sustaining, but life-enhancing, that those cultures will have to have developed some version or versions of this journey of soul initiation. And so that is my prayer that I ended the book with. And you also asked about embodiment. Boy, that's a bigger, that's a bigger topic than I even would know. But in some ways, I'd say each person, each human, like everything else on the planet, is born to fulfill a particular niche in their environment. And for humans, our environment is the whole planet now. And the way we fulfill that niche, that unique place, that unique deep purpose or meaning, is the way we embody ourselves in the world. But there's many senses of the word embodiment, of course, and one is how we embrace and acknowledge and celebrate our particular individual bodies. And this is the art of doing that is one of the many things I believe we've lost in contemporary societies. And it relates to something I call in my book, Wild Mind, which presents a nature-based map of the human psyche. There are 4 facets of human wholeness, and one of them is we've mapped onto the south direction, or the middle of the day, or the summer. And it's has everything to do with how we embody ourselves and how we celebrate the particular body we have and our relationship to other bodies of all species. So I guess I'll stop there for now and hope that at least is the beginning of an answer to that great first question.
Yeah, wonderful. Beautiful. So Bill, you talk, I love this term that you use of through the initiatory process, one can become a true adult. And can you give a little description of the markings of what is a true adult?
Yeah, great question to get into. I was trained as a psychologist, pretty progressive orientation, but still Western psychology, which I've ended up having to conclude that most of what I've learned is either wrong or doesn't go deep enough. So my understanding of what maturity is, including what a true adult is completely off the map of the Western world of understandings of things. So because the way we think of maturity, for me, it's essentially an early adolescent understanding of maturity. And that's hard enough to attain for contemporary people because of our a lack of true deep support through families and education and religion and so forth for truly maturing. But an early adolescent version of maturity, which is pretty much what we have in our culture now, is something like it's a person who's accepted and is fulfilling certain responsibilities, like being a good neighbor or holding down a job or raising kids or helping out people who need help, or someone who has certain skills like nonviolent communication, or someone who doesn't get lost too often in addictions, or losing their temper and so forth and so on. And so I'm not saying all of that's wrong and that's not mature, but it's a healthy culture, an early adolescent, a a 13-year-old would have all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And same with an adult. I don't mean someone over a certain age or someone who is fulfilling certain kinds of responsibilities and so on, but it's something that actually has practically disappeared. It's disappeared off our map. And my best guess is, it's kind of hard to say and maybe harder to hear, that I would guess almost somewhere around 90% of people in contemporary society, certainly in the Western world, never reach true adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
I have to take a deep breath myself when I hear myself say that. And it's become common in certain circles to acknowledge that we don't have that many genuine elders in our society anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We have olders, but not true elders. And that's a hard enough pill to swallow, but not too many people have ended up with the conclusion and publicly announced it like I have,
Mm-hmm.
that I don't believe we have that many true adults.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's just a preface to my answer. And so here's one of my definitions of a true adult. It's somebody, a person, who experiences their primary membership in life as being in the more than human world, or the larger Earth community. That is their primary place of belonging as they experience it. So they have a true adult has all kinds of other identities that lends beautiful color to their individual life, like their gender identity or their sexual orientation or their ethnicity or their religious faith or their family or their social group or their career and so on. But a true adult is someone, first and foremost, they experience their true membership as being in the Earth community, that they feel totally at home in this greater web of life. And second, they are a person who has had one or more revelations, you can call it visions or mystical experiences, that have allowed them to glimpse the unique place that they have individually in that community, namely the Earth community. You know, we think of identity in the contemporary world as strictly in relationship to our social or cultural world. I have a certain social role or a certain job and so forth, and that's, or certain sexual orientation, so on, and that's my primary identity. But for a true adult, they've, as I say, this is the second part of a three-part definition. It's they've had one or more revelations of their unique place in the larger Earth community. I'll come back to that in a second because it's important to clarify something there. And the third part of the definition is that a true adult has found one or more ways to embody that ecological identity as a gift to their people and also to the greater Earth community. So another way to say all this is a true adult is someone who has this deep experience of purpose and meaning, but it's way deeper than anything that ever could be defined or identified in terms of a social role or a job or a career or even a creative project. And then people often ask me about that second part of the definition, that a person's had one or more glimpses or revelations of their, what I call their unique ecological niche. And people ask, well, do you mean like, you know, literally like what you eat and what you offer your ecosystem? And my answer is not quite. That the way it works for us humans with our mode of consciousness is that although we're born with that knowledge, some traditions call it our original instructions, are the knowledge we're born with about what our unique place is to take is in the larger Earth community. Although we're born with that, it's not linguistic knowledge because it's before we even have a language, a human language. And so the way that our psyche communicates to us our unique place during the initiatory process, the unique place in the ecological world, is through metaphor. that we glimpse an image, or we become aware of like a poetic line or a dance or a pattern that our life has always made, but we weren't quite aware of it on some deep symbolic, you could say, symbolic level. And that experience that I call soul encounter, that's that glimpse, that revelation of our unique ecological place. That revelation shows us what we've come to call here at Animus our mythopoetic identity. Mythopoetic identity, because it's communicated to us in metaphor, in terms of image, or a dream symbol, or a deeply meaningful encounter with some other being of our natural world. So then I could summarize and say a true adult is someone who knows, who's discovered their mythopoetic identity and has been shape-shifted by it, whose ego has been shape-shifted by that lightning strike of that encounter with their personal mythos.
Yeah.
It's so rich.
Yeah, and I just appreciate the centrality of the more than human world as far as maturation.
I really love how you use the image of adults and elders as imaginal selves in culture. Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, beautiful question, thanks. This comes from one of the analogies we use at Animus Valley Institute for the descent to soul. So let me back up just a little bit and say the journey of soul initiation is this process of several years. It's actually a whole stage of life, namely the stage that most contemporary humans never reach. And it corresponds to late adolescence. And I call it the cocoon stage for reasons that will become obvious if it isn't already. And during this cocoon stage, which is typically several years for someone who's going through it well, and it can be many, 10, 20 or more years, or you can get stuck in that stage, as I think a lot of people of my own generation, basically hippies, the boomers got stuck in this stage. A lot of them, a lot never reached it. So the metaphor we use for the descent to soul, which is a particular spiritual adventure that could take as little as a week and could take many months or years even to go through, the metaphor, we use a couple analogies, and one is what a caterpillar goes through. And we've mapped the descent onto 5 phases, and it's partly, the 5 phases are in part taken from what a caterpillar goes through. And the names of those phases are preparation, dissolution, soul encounter, metamorphosis, and enactment. So I'll go through them kind of quickly, and this is to answer your question about imaginal cells. The preparation for a moth is the final part of preparation is to spin a cocoon. If it's a moth caterpillar, it's to create this space for this transformation. And for a butterfly caterpillar, it actually turns its own body into something like a cocoon that, of course, is called a chrysalis. And that prepares the space for the initiatory journey or the transformation. And the dissolution is when literally the body of the caterpillar dissolves. It becomes caterpillar soup. And for a human, when that's happening for us on a descent to soul, that means our social and vocational identity just leaves us. It dissolves. It's like often called a dismemberment experience. But it's not the kind of thing that early adolescents go through, which is to say that most contemporary humans go through many times, because not only is it a loss of our current social role or social circle or career or where we live, but it's the loss of faith that we could ever identify ourselves again in terms of any social role or vocation or creative project, that whole way of identifying yourself just disappears completely. That's the dissolution for the human. For the caterpillar, after its body has dissolved into liquid, then there are these cells in its body that have been there all along, that have been hiding out inside the caterpillar body because the caterpillar's immune system sees them as foreign invaders. But in fact, they are the seeds of the adult for the caterpillar. And biologists call these cells imaginal cells. And they're speaking biology because the biologist's name for an adult of these species, namely a butterfly or a moth, is the imago, I-M-A-G-O. So the imaginal cells are the ones who know how to build an imago out of the recyclable materials of a former caterpillar. And so the imaginal cells go to work. And when the imaginal cells wake up, that's the phase that corresponds to what I call soul encounter. For the human, it's that moment of that glimpse of our mythopoetic identity. And some people think, oh, okay, you get the message and you hang up the phone. When it comes to us humans, we have the soul encounter, the glimpse of who we were born to be in an ecological sense. In my case, what I was shown my first soul encounter, that it was my place in the world to weave cocoons for myself and help other people weave cocoons for themselves to go through this kind of transformation. But then the fourth essential phase of the descent to soul happens. We call it, again, metamorphosis. And for the caterpillar, that's when the imaginal cells, who now become something like architects, start reassembling the materials of the former caterpillar into a butterfly body. And this takes a while. For us humans, it also takes a while. It can take months and typically years, or a year or two or three, depending on the person and whether they have guidance and so forth, where there are practices that we can engage in, we humans, after our soul encounter, that support the image, the mythopoetic identity, to shapeshift our egos, because for caterpillars, their bodies change radically, not so for us humans. It's our psyches, our egos, that are shapeshifted from an adolescent ego, which is basically an agent for itself, even a healthy agent for a healthy self, into an adult ego, which experiences itself first and foremost as an agent or handmaiden for soul, as a person who was born with the burden and the blessing to bring a certain possibility to the world, which is identified by their mythopoetic image. So I'll leave out the enactment. Well, I'll just say briefly, the enactment phase for the butterfly or the moth after it's stepped out of the cocoon but can't fly yet is to spend some time learning how to fly before it will attempt to fly. And what it has to do is pump fluid through its wings and then start to flap its wings until the structures are mature enough to fly. And that's true for humans too. There's a process we have to go through before we can actually create a mature delivery system for our mythopoetic identity. Okay, now I remember your question was about adults and elders as imaginal cells. For, how did I say it, for a healthy culture? So by analogy, the way you get from an unhealthy adolescent culture like our own, it's not even a healthy adolescent culture, it's what I call a patho-adolescent culture, where children are murdering each other in schools and in the streets, and we're destroying our environment and so on and on. That's not a healthy adolescent culture. But to get to a truly mature, life-enhancing culture, what we need are adults, true adults, who are able to embody and manifest their true work in the world, and to work together with other true adults and create what I call vision ecologies. And what this results in is new social structures that come directly from mystery or from soul, that become the organic elements, the imaginal cells, if you will, of a new culture. Because I believe that you can't get the most brilliant, mature group of people and sit them down together for a year or two and tell them, okay, your task is to create a healthy culture. I don't believe it can be done. It's never done that way. I do believe we can, with our strategic minds and groups of mature humans, can get together and can strategically design a life-sustaining culture, which is to say a healthy adolescent culture. That can be done. And there are groups and individuals all over the world doing that and have been for many decades and making some great progress. Whether we'll get there in time or not, we don't know. But it is possible to use our conscious strategic minds to create a healthy adolescent culture. But a truly mature, life-enhancing culture is, you might say, it's inspired by and fueled by mystery. And true adults and elders are the imaginal cells that allow that culture to grow, to self-organize on its own. And that's a process of many, many, many generations. And whether we'll have the chance to do that depends on whether this century and maybe this decade and the next, we're able to strategically create life-sustaining cultures.
Yeah. I know you go into more detail in the book around this, but I'm thinking, if listeners out there are wondering, like, what stage am I at in this process? And because it seems that what might be an appropriate practice for the cocoon could be devastating for early adolescence, or something that's healing in early adolescence could be kind of preventing a descent into a cocoon. So how do people gauge where they are and what kind of practices or medicine is needed?
Really good question. It's an essential question, because you just said it very clearly and accurately, that if you're not in the cocoon yet, and most people aren't, and you pretend to be, you could really do some significant harm to yourself. So here's the long answer that can be expressed very briefly, is my book, Nature and the Human Soul. that book lays out what I call a nature-based map of human development. It's very, very different than anything, even the most progressive things we have in Western psychology. It is literally nature-based, and I use nature's own cycles as the template for this map, and it's an 8-stage map. There's 2 stages of childhood, 2 of adolescence, 2 of adulthood, 2 of elderhood. And as I either said or implied earlier, most contemporary humans in industrialized cultures only get to the 3rd stage, which is early adolescence, and they spend the rest of their lives stuck there. And there's a passage at the end of every stage. And in a healthy culture, the community, the village, provides a person who's going from one stage to the next with a rite of passage. And by the way, people often think the work we do at Animus is rites of passage, and it isn't at all. Our work is to support people to go through a stage of life, namely the cocoon stage, which is where the journey of soul initiation takes place. And that stage starts with a passage and ends with a passage, but the actual initiatory process of several years is not a passage, it's a stage. So, but I'm mentioning this now because the passage from early adolescence to late adolescence, which is to say, from what I call the oasis, that's early adolescence, to the cocoon, is the passage I call confirmation. And this is important because you asked, well, how do you know what stage you're in? And my brief answer is, have you gone through confirmation? Mm-hmm. So I want to say what I mean by that. What's confirmed at that passage, the one that takes you into the cocoon, is that you have created a social presence, an early adolescent social presence that is authentic to who you really are on a personality level and is socially acceptable to at least one peer group, that you belong, that you've achieved authentic social belonging. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if that sounds hard to you two or to our listeners, but it's challenging even in a healthy culture, although virtually everybody succeeds at it. But in a culture, society like our contemporary ones, it's really challenging because there's such an emphasis on conformity, which is to say social acceptance, which is to say fitting in and being invited to parties and so on, and being seen as someone who's socially or sexually alluring, which is that's all important and truly important to an early adolescent. But if the emphasis is so much on conformity, then what gets thrown out is the other half of the task of early adolescence, which is developing our true authenticity, which is to say, knowing what our true innate values are, that are probably somewhat different than our parents. Probably some similarities, but probably some differences too. And knowing what our true interest is and our true style, and what really turns us on, what really brings us alive, mm-hmm. and what kinds of people we connect with on a deep level and what kinds we don't. Mm-hmm. Because it's natural that we know nobody connects with everybody, and the important thing is to know, to be able to tell who we really connect with, and so these are all just examples of social authenticity that's so important in early adolescence. So if you've gone through confirmation or you're in the passage of confirmation, you would be someone who has achieved a certain kind of social success, that people like you, they like to hang out with you, they really enjoy who you are, and you're being fully authentic. You're someone who knows who you are, and that's hard enough in the contemporary world. You know what your true values are and so on. So all these things are true about you, but also true about you is that any further success in that realm isn't particularly alluring anymore. Mm. It's just climbing up the corporate ladder, if you happen to be on that ladder, is no longer what moves you. Further, great successes sexually or socially would be fine, but it's not really what you're about anymore. Mm-hmm. You've begun to lose your faith, as I mentioned earlier, that you could ever identify yourself in a deep way in terms of social role or creative project or career. And in addition, during confirmation, you start feeling a longing that you had never felt before. It's maybe similar to longings, but because it's erotic in a certain way, but it's much deeper. The way this is said in many traditions is that you start to hear the call from your soul, or as Joseph Campbell called it, the call to spiritual adventure. And it's something you had never experienced before. And in a culture like ours, you might not even know what's happening to you. In a healthy culture, you would know, and the elders would be there in the village, and they would see that it was happening to you. Mm-hmm. And the elders would say, congratulations, you've just completed the oasis stage. They'd say something, some version of that. And now you're confirmed as being ready to enter the initiatory journey. Mm. And so you're going to come with us, and we're taking you out of everyday village life. We might even take you out of the village, and you're going to go into this initiation camp that you might have heard about, but maybe you thought it would never happen to you. But that's in a healthy culture. In our culture, our contemporary industrialized cultures, again, it's a person who starts hearing this longing, who perhaps maybe you've been a very social creature, but suddenly you really want to spend your time alone most of the time, or in semi-wild places if you can get to them. You start listening to a different voice, that life starts to have a certain kind of verticality that it didn't have before, and in particular, a certain depth. And in our society, if you don't know what's going on, you might think you're starting to lose your mind. And if you go to see a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, or even a life coach, they're likely to feel that something's going wrong with you and try to rescue you from this experience. That's one of the unfortunate ways of finding out you're in confirmation. So for a person who's moved from the oasis, that's early adolescence, to the cocoon, that's my name for late adolescence, you're someone whose center of gravity has shifted from the social and sexual world to what I call the mysteries of nature and psyche. It doesn't mean the social world and sexual world is no longer of interest to you. It doesn't mean that at all. But your center of gravity, the hub of your life, what's most important for you, like when you wake up in the morning, we all know this. When we wake up in the morning, our first thoughts have to do with what's most important to us, what we hope to achieve. And in early adolescence, we hope to achieve, some further development of our social life or our vocational life, assuming that we're not in some midst of some other major crisis, then it's social or vocational. That's the things that come to our mind. But when we've moved into the cocoon, it's like the first thing that occurs to us in the morning is, what can I do today to walk or wander further into the mysteries of this enchanted, immensely diverse, deeply mysterious world? And that's what counts. So if this sounds like you, listener, you might be either in confirmation or through it. And if it doesn't sound like you, then it turns out it's really not that hard to complete the tasks of early adolescence. You just need some guidance about how you do it, because what we consider to be psychological or spiritual development in the contemporary world, almost none of it will actually help you complete the tasks of early adolescence. And again, in my book, Nature and the Human Soul, I go through the kinds of practices that help. And also in my book, Wild Mind, I do that. And even if you're in the cocoon or in later stages, we're never done with cultivating our innate facets of human wholeness. And that's what I describe in the book Wild Mind. And there's always more work to do with that.
It's so rich. I want to ask you so many questions right now. I'm going to ramble my way through this question and see if I can tie these two things together and ask you to comment on it.
Okay.
I was struck by one passage in your recent book where you say, once a tribe produces a single individual determined to hoard and able and willing to use lethal force to do so, the cultural fabric of that society begins to unravel. And that's so sad, because it seems like that is the fabric of our culture right now, is
totally
so many people determined to hoard and wanting to use force to do so. It even, increased gun sales during this year of pandemic and political upheaval. So there's that side of it. And then I was struck by a place where you quote Mary Oliver asking the only one question, which is how to love the world. And the difference between these mindsets of hoarding and I think you use the word about like honing our ability for romancing the world and the capacity to swoon for a sunset, and how I'm just struck by how much more pleasurable it actually is to be able to feel rich by swooning at a sunset and romancing the world than this hoarding mentality. And both of those point toward, again, why is it important that we have initiated adults, because that fraying fabric of miserable hoarders is just no way to live, for ourselves or the very fabric of life. Mm-hmm. Anything you want to say about all of that?
Yeah, how many days do you have?
Many, as long as you want.
Well, I'll start with something I learned from reading a book about 30 or 40 years ago called The Parable of the Tribes. And it's written by, I think of him as a historian, but I don't know if he was formally trained as one. His name is, interesting last name, Andrew Schmuckler. And it's The Parable of the Tribes. And boy, I think he nailed it. And he said, many thousands of years ago, depending on the particular culture, but like Western world for sure, some at least 5,000 years ago, we can say, it's a parable, we can say something went wrong with a certain tribe, say in the Middle East. And what went wrong is that a person, probably a man, maybe a youngish man, became the ruler in some sense of that tribe. And he had never been initiated into true adulthood. And not only that, he didn't do very well with early adolescence. And maybe that was relatively rare to happen in a tribe like that, but there was, in some tribe that happened, and he got a lot of power. And being an early adolescent, actually a patho-adolescent, he felt that this is after, the beginning of agriculture, because there wasn't much to hoard before that. But after agriculture, you could have surplus and you could hoard. Mm-hmm. So he would start hoarding for himself and for his tribe, and then recognized that his biggest enemy, the biggest threat he had to his rule of hoarding and enslaving some of his own people, the biggest threat were the initiation rites and the true adults and the true elders. And so that's one of the first things he had to do, was get rid of the elders, murder them, and the true adults, as many as he could find, and outlaw the initiation processes and ceremonies. In other words, he had to make sure his people would stay adolescent, or even basically children, psychologically. And after ruining his own tribe, his own culture in that way, or maybe 3 or 4 generations later of the same kind of rulers, that person would then look around to the neighboring tribes and say, if hoarding as much as I can from my own people and enslaving my own people is a good thing for me, then why don't we do that with the neighbors as well? Mm-hmm. And so they would then attack their neighbors to enslave their people and to get their surplus in their land, and so forth. And what Schmuckler does in his book is he asks the question, well, what's going to happen once that gets started? And there's only a certain number of possibilities. And I think if I remember them correctly, it's either that that first tribe wipes out their neighbor tribes, or the neighbor tribes become armed and violent in order to defend themselves, and that wrecks their culture, or the neighboring tribes flee. And what Schmuckler ends up saying is, that's the history of the world over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years, and that's what's been happening. And dominator cultures, as Riane Eisler refers to them in her book, The Chalice and the Blade, wipe out what she calls the partnership cultures. And the dominators have been doing that for 5,000 to 10,000 years, and we've basically committed cultural genocide, in other words, or physical genocide against most every culture in the world. There's a few intact, healthy ones left, but we don't even want to talk about them because they haven't been ruined yet. And so again, I think it's an unavoidable initiation process that we're in. And what it contrasts with is what you so beautifully described yourself in asking this question, that we humans, like everything else on this planet, were evolved to love the world, and to love the world by giving away to it, by contributing in the world, participating in the world in the way that as a group, our tribe only can, and our species only can, and as individuals that we individually only can. And in loving the world, we are contributing to the health of all the other species, including our own, and to all the other habitats. And we're also taking the unique role, or roles, that only we humans can take, that we have been evolved to take. And we're not doing a very good job, obviously, yet, but we're in this initiatory crisis, this transformation time, where our consciousness is beginning to shift, and we're beginning to create the structures for an actually healthy culture, which I believe necessarily includes this journey of soul initiation. So we're individually learning how to romance the world again, to fall in love with this world. And we fall in love with this world as children. And in a different way, we fall in love with the world as early adolescents in the oasis. And then in late adolescence, the cocoon, we fall in love with the world in a different way. The world becomes this much more mysterious place, and our own psyches become incredibly mysterious. It's like we realize we hardly know ourselves yet. And we might be terrified by our own psyches, but we also are romantically alert to our own psyches. Just like when we fall in love with another human, that there's this allurement, but there's also this terror that on some level we know we're going to be changed if we let ourselves fall in love. But in the cocoon, it's amplified because now we're also falling in love with the mysteries of the world in a way we never have before. And it is terrifying as well as deeply alluring. The call to the depths meets this deep longing we've always felt but didn't really know how to name it or where it was taking us. Now we know it's taking us to the mysterious wilds of the outer world, and also to the mysterious depths of our own psyche. And then when we go through the passage of soul initiation, which is how the cocoon ends, and then healthy culture or community would create a rite of passage for you at the end of your journey of soul initiation into adulthood. And let me add here that every stage of life, if it's a healthy version of that stage, is the best stage of life to be in. It's not, the later stages are not better, they're just different. And in a healthy culture, though, people go through all the stages. But when we go through a passage, it's a kind of achievement, but it always feels also like a tremendous loss, because we're now about to leave the best stage of life to be in, which was whatever stage we were in. And that's why rites of passage are so important, because it helps a person who's going through a passage, not because any other person has, announced that they're going through a passage, but because mystery has sent them through a passage. And the rite of passage supports the person to get oriented to the new life stage, which is really different than what they're used to, and also lets the whole village know, the whole community know, this person has gone through this really difficult passage, they could use some support. When we go through soul initiation, it's a terrible thing, because we just got kicked out of mystery school. We just had several years in a school, in a passage where we're wandering through the world, we're discovering new mysteries that are challenging, but so deeply alluring and enchanting every day. And now basically mystery is saying, good job. Now you're going to actually have to do something with all these things you've learned about the world and about who you truly are. And it's all going to be about serving the world. And at the time of that passage, soul initiation, you say to yourself, oh no, I just got kicked out of the best stage of life. And it might be a few months before you learn how to deliver your gift to the world, before you start experiencing the deep joy of doing that. And when that happens, you're able to love the world in a way you never have before. And you say to yourself accurately, this is the best stage of life to be in. And you'll keep saying that until the next passage. And when you enter yet a more challenging stage. Okay.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about just the urgency of these times, and the image of, from the Buddhist tradition of like practicing as though your hair is on fire, and the urgency of what's happening with climate that so many people can't even open their awareness to, and yet at the same time that this initiatory process isn't something that can be rushed or hurried in any way, and how to hold the urgency and the organic process together.
Can I add one more thing? Just because you talk about maturity and adulthood, there's this phrase that I often contemplate and wonder into, which is mature urgency. What is a mature urgency in these times?
Nice one. Yeah. I use the framework that my teacher and friend, Joanna Macy, uses, our beloved earth elder of this, one of our great earth elders of this time, also a scholar of Buddhism and environmental and nuclear and peace activist and so on, and the creator of the work that Reconnects, also called Despair and Empowerment work. So probably most of our listeners know of Joanna's work and her several books, and she's the one who coined the phrase "the Great Turning," which we're in the midst of right now. This great turning from what she calls a life-destroying industrialized culture to a life-sustaining culture. And she has suggests these three dimensions. She and her wonderful co-author Molly Young Brown, in their book Coming Back to Life, they outline three dimensions of the Great Turning. And by the way, I want to add a fourth one to that. And the first one is most urgent. And that is saving as much life as we can while our industrial growth economies are collapsing, which of course they are. And there's so many people in organizations, as we know, who are doing just brilliant, creative, visionary work at saving as much life as possible as the old order crumbles. So that's the most urgent thing. And it's way more urgent than creating new models for the journey of soul initiation. And the second dimension is analyzing the structure of the industrial growth society, which I'd say the dominator societies, and doing that in order to create new infrastructure for healthy cultures. And that's happening, even while all the horrors are still happening that everybody can create their own list of. We also know there are organizations and individuals doing just stunning visionary work at creating new approaches to economy, monetary systems, agriculture, energy, education, you name it, everything. It's happening. And that is urgent and is happening. And then the third dimension is what Joanna and Molly call a shift in our perception of reality, or a change in our consciousness and values. And if you look carefully at what they say, they're basically saying deep ecology, or they're saying learning, again, shifting our consciousness so that we experience the natural world as sacred and holy, and that our deepest opportunity is to serve and enhance the health of the larger world, the Earth community. And so for me, this third dimension, which is, again, about experiencing ourselves as innate members of this larger animate world. This is that shift in consciousness is what we at Animist Valley Institute call ecological awakening or eco-awakening. And it's something that in a healthy culture, no one ever goes through because no one ever has to, because you don't lose it. Because every human child is born with a natural intuition that it's related to everything. And so you do little children in early childhood, they will greet everything as if it's kin. And everything is something, beings that we're creatures that we're related to. But because of our educational systems and our cultural framework, sometimes called the matrix, children lose that very, very early. And they get to eventually their early teen years, and they've lost it completely. Which is to say, they end up in an unhealthy early adolescence that I call conforming and rebelling. In order to get from an unhealthy early adolescence to a healthy one, namely the oasis, we have to go through this experience in which we have this somatic knowing that we are as wild and as natural as anything else on the planet, namely the very same experience we had in our first year or two of life. But now we're doing it with our early adolescent consciousness, and it's ecological. We call it ecological awakening, and it's what I believe what Joanna and Molly are referring to by the third dimension of the Great Turning. But in order to get from life-sustaining cultures, which we have to do in the next decade or two, to a truly healthy, mature, life-enhancing culture, we need processes that will get most of us into true adulthood and eventually true elderhood. So that's not the most urgent thing to do, but I think it's essential to start now. Among other things, it responds to this deep longing that most everybody feels, even though they might not be able to name it, or they wouldn't use the same language I use to describe it. But it's going to take, again, several generations of designing for every culture, and maybe every subculture has to design their own version of the journey of soul initiation that fits for those people. And it'll take some generations before you have a majority of people over 20 years old who have reached true adulthood. And that's when we'll see these truly mature cultures developing, which are capable of being conscious partners with evolution. So there's the deeper work that we need to start now, and then the most urgent work that we really have to have our hair lit on fire to save as much life as possible.
It's wonderful. I just want to say that I also study and facilitate the work that Reconnects, and I'm teaching a class right now called Embodying the Great Turning, and we're working with a somatic relationship and all of this as well. And I really love that that fourth dimension of adulthood and elderhood. It feels so important. Love that.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. And also there's something as I notice myself swinging between, probably a not helpful urgency. And I just, as you bring that deep time perspective, it's so settling, like, right, it's going to take many generations. And I love that in your work, how you include the long view. So we're just about at an hour, and I know we both would love to talk to you for so many hours longer, but I would love to end for now, and hopefully we can continue another time with this question from your recent book again. And this is, I think, the end of the book before the appendix. I love this so much, and then would just love you to comment on it. You write, "Are you willing and able to love this world, even though your ego is fated to leave it? even though this world requires your ego to leave it. Long before your final breath, will you risk your current life and identity for the possibility of uncovering your most sacred of tasks, your unique, soul-infused service to this world?
Mm.
So beautiful.
Yeah. Many wise persons from many traditions, maybe all traditions, have said something like the first half of life, generally speaking, has to do with learning how to live and learning what our life is about and what we can contribute to this world. And the second half starts to change its focus towards learning how to come to peace with our mortality and the fact that we'll die. And I believe that what allows us to do that, coming to peace with mortality, what allows us to do that in the deepest way is that we've come to see that we were born with a gift to give this world, or even that we were born as a gift for this world, that each one of us is, you could say, medicine for this world. But we don't know it, we can't identify it, and we can't deliver that medicine to the world unless we go through this journey of soul initiation, which again, we did not invent at Animus Valley Institute. It's as old as humanity. Every healthy culture has their own version. And what we're doing at Animus is simply creating a version that is contemporary and Western and nature-based. So yeah, we, towards sometime in the second half of our life, we are confronted with this question: are we willing to love this world, even though we're fated to, or designed even to leave it? And for me, this results in a certain kind of experience of hope that I think is so essential at this time, because it's not the kind of hope that we're just merely predicting that things will turn out well, especially because some other people will fix things, but rather the kind of hope that comes with our birth. And it comes with our birth because if it's true that we humans are like everything else on the planet, namely that we were born as a species or evolved as a species and born individually with a particular gift for this world, a unique gift for this world, then it really is true that we are the ones we've been waiting for, or as they say, or that we really have what it would take to get us through this particular initiatory crisis that is species-wide and planetary-wide at this time. So I ended up with kind of an answer to Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am," which probably everybody has rejected that in all kinds of levels by now. But my version is something like, "I am, therefore I hope." Or you could say, "I am ensouled, therefore I hope," which is a slightly longer version of is that I was born as a particular unique gift for this world. And that's where my hope comes from the depths of my own being, that if I can discover and be shapeshifted by and embody who I came here to be, then if enough of us are doing that, that'll change everything in a life-enhancing way.
Oh, may we all take that in.
What a beautiful place to land in this conversation. I just want to say thank you for your work and the way you're having this your own long apprenticeship, but also this long game of shaping culture and supporting so many people to also take this out into the world. And thank you so much for this conversation.
You're welcome. And thank you for saying that. It means a lot to me. And thank you for the invitation and the conversation and your great questions. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.